All right, thank you everyone for joining us. This is the Bidenomics panel, in case any of you thought that you were attending something that was less enlightening and more boring than that. In fact, this is the place to be, and it would kind of shock me if we didn't see this room fill out when everyone starts to realize the talent that I have here on the stage with me. Yeah, exactly. Look around. You're the important people. You are the informed people. So I am joined today by two remarkable economists that I'm really looking forward to this conversation. We have both my colleague at the far end of the stage, Vance Ginn. Yes. Vance started out as an intern at the Texas Public Policy Foundation many, many years ago, and then came back and asked for a job. And it's like, hey, what have you done? Well, I got a Ph.D. in economics. So we ended up hiring the guy. He is our chief economist at TPPF, and that actually means something because we have more than one economist, because we're a big think tank. And I actually really enjoy going down to the where the economists hang out and rattling their cages and just seeing what they're up to. Sometimes they can speak in entire paragraphs that no mortal human can understand. He's lectured classes on multiple economic courses at Texas Tech. What do they do there? Oh my gosh. And Sam Houston University, no one knows what they do there. Served as Associate Director for Economic Policy at the Office of Management and Budget, otherwise known as the OMB, at the Executive Office of the President during whose administration?
Trump administration.
Oh, the Trump administration. Okay. Yeah, fantastic. That's good. That's great. I'm not going to go into my Trump invitations. I'd just embarrass myself because they're not good enough yet. He also advised the OMB's director on economic policy matters, made the Trump tax cuts permanent, or at least as permanent as they can be with Congress hanging around, and provided in-depth analyses during the COVID-19 pandemic. In May 2020, he returned to TPPF like a bad penny to coordinate the Opportunity Project, and he develops policy recommendations for state budget cuts and spending priorities. And what's important about that is when it's state budget cuts, they're kind of a little modest here. It's hard to get everything in these bullet points. What this is talking about is trying to get the concept of what we call the conservative Texas budget into other states, where we encourage other states not to grow their budget requirements faster than the people in that state can afford to pay for them. Sounds kind of reasonable, doesn't it? So if it's reasonable, it means it's controversial. He earned his Ph.D. in economics at Texas Tech, whatever university. Now, to bring some class to this panel, rather than just Vance and myself with a fading redhead and a bright redhead, we have Tyler Goodspeed. And it's a really cool name, actually, when you think of when I think of your name in economics, I think of velocity, right? Velocity of money supply, right? You want it at a good speed. And that's how I remember your name. I'm a nerd, I can't help it. He's the Kleinheinz Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University and is the U.S. Director at Greenmantle LLC. What that means is occasionally he gets Victor Davis Hanson sightings because he's on the same campus with VDH, which is pretty cool, actually. He served as chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors and advised the administration's economic response to the coronavirus pandemic and subsequent economic recovery packages. He's been part of the faculty of economics at the University of Oxford and was a lecturer in economics at King's College in London, which probably means if he really wanted to, he could also speak without us understanding him. He's published extensively in peer-reviewed and edited journals on financial regulation, banking, and monetary economics. He received his BA, MA, PhD from Harvard, and received his MPhil. You don't see that very often, MPhil, from the University of Cambridge, where he was a Gates Scholar. So you're dealing with an enormous amount of intellectual firepower up here on this side of the stage, and I get to just ask some interesting questions. And so what I'd like to first ask, and we'll start, Vance, with you, is we have seen inflation at the consumer level accelerate to a point that we have not seen really since the cooling down of the period of stagflation under Jimmy Carter. Was this something that you anticipated, number one? And number two, tell us where you think it's going to go in the next couple of years.
All right, well, thank you, Chuck, and it's a pleasure to be with you, all of you today. It's also a good pleasure to be with my good friend, Tyler Goodspeed. He was chief economist at CEA when I was chief economist of OMB. So we were part of what's called the Troika, the three-headed kind of monster thing where we did all the forecasting for the president's budget. And
I'm the monster over here.
You're the one over there.
Three-headed, I'm the monster in this panel.
Yes, yes. So it's a pleasure to have you here. But inflation, right? Has anybody been feeling inflation? Everybody has their hands up. You see prices all around you continue to go up. And inflation is really just too much money chasing too few goods, right? And you think about what's going on out there. Over the last year, they recently reported, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, that inflation's up 7% year over year. 7%. It's the highest since 1982. So basically a whole generation, 40 years, right, that we've actually seen this high of inflation. And so then the question becomes, well, why? Well, as my favorite economist, Milton Friedman, said, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. So the first thing you really got to look at is the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet since the pandemic started has more than doubled, from about a little over $4 trillion to a little over $8 trillion, massive amount of increase in the money supply that's being put out in the economy. And then you think about, well, what are they buying? A lot of what they buy is government debt. The national debt is about $30 trillion now. It's a massive amount that's out there, and it's increased substantially just over the last couple of years. And so that increase in the debt has given more ammunition for the Fed to purchase with their open market operations. And just in simple terms, it's helped to increase the money supply. So more money being put in the system. At the same time that you've had all these policies that are being put in place by the Congress, Democrats in Congress, and the Biden administration that are holding back the supply side. So if you're restraining supply and you're increasing demand with the increase in the money supply, that's too much money chasing too few goods, and you have rapid inflation all around you, to where now we're seeing shortages, labor shortages. It's hard not to go into a restaurant nowadays and not find that there's some sort of shortage, where it's taking you a little longer to get your food, a little longer to pay out, maybe even take a little longer to be seated. And so we're seeing these things all around us. And so some are questioning, is this transitory, or do we have any inflation? You know, the White House has been changing their language almost daily. What's going on around there. And, you know, some of my more free market leaning economists thought that it was more transitory. We've been saying that it was going to be more persistent, just given the underlying fundamentals of what the economy was doing and how much money the Federal Reserve has been printing. I didn't see a way that this could only be transitory. And the question is, how long is transitory? And so I think what we will see is that there will be continued increase in inflation, given that the producer price index, the wholesale prices that are out there, are growing at almost 10%. So the producer price index, that measure of wholesale prices, hasn't been passed along completely to the consumer. So there's still this inertia that's out there of higher prices that I think that we'll see. The Federal Reserve did say that they're going to start maybe tapering off or stopping some of their quantitative easing in March and start to raise interest rates. If that's credible, then that should help to slow inflation, but that's still going to take some time. It took some time to get to the point of 7%. It's going to take some time to get us back down, and it's distorting markets all around us. And so I think it's a very costly situation we're in that oftentimes, or most of the time, hurts the middle class and the poor the most, and they can't afford it.
Tyler, what about you? Did you how obvious was this Mack truck coming down the highway, and do you think that this is going to be a persistent phenomenon?
First of all, it's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me, and Vance, good to see you. And so I did actually publish some pieces on this back in March, April of 2021, and actually I was declined by the Wall Street Journal, a piece on what I projected to be declining real wages, declining inflation-adjusted wages in 2021. People are like, oh no, nominal wages are going up a ton. I said, well, when you actually adjust for month-over-month increases in inflation, real wages are going down. So I think in terms of this question about persistence, it's important to think about some of the factors behind the inflation surge in 2021 and which of those we expect to persist into 2022. So on the supply side in 2021, we had, by my estimations, 1.5 million early retirements since the start of the pandemic. And the promise of higher income tax rates was not really going to do a lot to entice a lot of those folks back. We had 1.3 million Americans reporting that they didn't look for work in the past month because of all pandemic reasons. We had 1.1 million Americans report that an adult in their household didn't look for work in the past month because of pandemic-related childcare issues. On top of that, we had a $1.8 trillion cumulative shortfall in business investment, so we were not getting new plant and equipment. And we had the extension of enhanced unemployment insurance benefits through September, so this is a year and a half into the recovery, that further disincentivized the return to work. Even as that was phasing out, we had the introduction in July 2021 of an expanded child tax credit without work requirements. Yep. So that's all on the supply side. Right. Then on top of that, in March 2021, we have a pure demand side fiscal stimulus of sending payments to households equal to almost 10% of the US economy. That was the magnitude of the fiscal expansion in March, April 2021. Now, a lot of those supply side issues, and then as Vance pointed out, Milton Friedman, always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, that fiscal expansion, the Federal Reserve immediately monetized in basically a classic helicopter money drop by immediately purchasing in the secondary market $120 billion a month of new federal government debt. Now, part of that is gonna be easing we should say tightening in 2022, but given the pace that the Federal Reserve has articulated, real interest rates are going to remain in deeply negative territory well into 2022. That is very expansionary for inflation.
So explain for the crowd, a real interest rate is something that until recently was almost like a theoretical thing. What is a real interest rate? How does that it has something to do with inflation, doesn't it?
It does. So the interest rate that you pay is supposed to include a compensation for future inflation, because a lender wants to be compensated not only for the risk of extending the loan, but also for the fact that the dollars that they're paid back in are going to be worth less, a year from now, 5 years from now. So they want to have some compensation for inflation. Now, because inflation has increased so rapidly, it actually means that after inflation, the interest rate that lenders are getting is negative. Yeah.
So borrow money.
So borrow money.
Yeah, if you can pay it back. Yeah. So I have a question, and I'd like to go first to you, Tyler, because you talked about some issues in the last year under Biden that were very interesting, because I've heard some critics say that, well, Trump owns some of this inflation because, when the pandemic hit, he did all these extraordinary things to, for example, loaning businesses money so they wouldn't have to immediately lay off their workers. But you mentioned one thing in particular that struck me about this more than $1 trillion of underinvestment. And as I remember, a month or so ago, we saw the largest drop in productivity in modern U.S. economic history as far as year over year. I think, what was it, 40%? There was some massive drop in productivity, which of course means that that goes to your supply side issue, right? So how much of this is merely a continuation of policies begun under Trump versus how much of this is the left-wing orientation of this administration doing things that actually discourage output, that discourage production? Could you kind of pull that apart a little bit for us?
Sure. So I'll start with the latter question about discouraging some of the supply side potential of the U.S. economy. So promising throughout most of 2021 to raise corporate income tax rates after 2021 is not going to help business investment recover. Similarly, allowing or signaling that you are going to allow a lot of the 2017 personal income tax rate cuts to expire is not going to do a lot to incentivize a return to work. Increasing transfer payments without work requirements is going to deter labor force participation. So that's the sort of active difference of the Biden administration policies in 2021. In terms of comparisons to the Trump administration response, yes, the Biden administration did some things that the Trump administration did as well in response to the COVID pandemic. I think, however, it is comparing apples and oranges to compare what the Trump administration did in March and April 2020, when huge swaths of the economy were shut down and 22 million Americans were laid off and sent on to unemployment insurance benefits, and we were facing the complete collapse of 70% of the US economy, and the situation in March 2021, when, according to the National Bureau of Economic Research, we were already 10 months into recovery. And the one final point of distinction, I would say, and this is something that Vance and I worked a lot on in the Trump administration response, was to introduce sunsets for a lot of those emergency pandemic provisions so that they were set to expire as the recovery proceeded. And I think the Biden administration just continued those.
Yeah, and if I could, Chuck, maybe even go back a little bit further of the huge differences between the policies of the Trump administration compared to the Biden administration. I mean, when you had the Trump administration of deregulation, energy independence, and really looking at tax cuts with TICJA is what we'd call it around the White House, but TCJA, or the Trump tax cuts of 2017, this was really about getting the supply side moving again. And that's really what we saw. I mean, you had a massive amount of economic growth, and it wasn't just for the upper income earners, which is often told by the left-wing media. If anything, the ones at the bottom, and y'all did some great research on this over at CEA, was they were the ones that had the largest gains in their wages. All the wages gained, but especially at the bottom. And job creation, a lot of them went to them as well. And if you look at the data going back to 2019, so before the pandemic and the shutdown recession, I like to call it the shutdown recession, but we'll see what they end up calling it later. But in 2019, the poverty rate was at the lowest on record. And if you looked at different demographics, Black, Hispanic, so forth, it was all at the lowest levels, right? Unemployment rates were at the lowest levels in a vibrant economy. And so inflation adjusted median household income was at the highest level on record. Those were the types of gains that you can get from more economic growth and prosperity. Now, for me, I would have liked for us to restrain government spending a little bit more, to be honest with you, but that's also Congress. In the last budget that I worked on and helped write was for fiscal year 21. In that budget from the administration, we found $4.6 trillion in savings over a decade. That was very much different compared to what actually happened, though, because of the last 2 years, Congress has authorized $7.2 trillion. $7.2 trillion, and that's in addition to the $4+ trillion in annual budget. Just a massive amount of money, and now we have this Build Back Better, which we've been calling Build Back Bankrupt, another $5 trillion in spending. Now they're going to put in all these fancy ways of shortening certain programs and all these other accounting gimmicks and make it say whatever they want. But so far, I'm glad that Senator Manchin, for example, isn't falling for it. We've estimated that it would add about $3 trillion more to the national debt that's already $30 trillion. And so this is something that we just can't afford, and Americans don't want.
So let's talk about the inevitable, all right? And by that I mean, you hinted at it earlier, regarding the Fed talking about scaling back. So if you go back to an earlier time in American history that some people in the audience may remember, as do I, you had, as I mentioned before, this period of stagflation, meaning low economic growth and high inflation under President Jimmy Carter, who is very fortunate as a former mostly failed president to have lived so long that he actually sees another president in his living time perform worse than he did. Yeah. So what happened under Carter was you had 3 back-to-back years of double-digit inflation, inflation over 10%. And the way that's wrung out of the system is you have to let interest rates rise, which then pulls back the economy. And you were hinting at it earlier, when the Federal Reserve purchases the debt issued by the U.S. government, What's the alternative? In other words, if you don't let the Fed, if the Fed doesn't purchase that debt, what happens to that debt? Explain very quickly for the audience, the Cliff Notes economic version. What happens when the Fed is not there to purchase these notes?
Interest rates will go up.
Well, why is that? Where's that money come from, though, that ends up buying those notes?
The private sector.
The private sector, who would otherwise use the money to do what?
Invest.
To grow the economy.
Grow the economy, yep.
So are you telling me, is this a roundabout way of saying we are about ready to hit a mega recession? Is that maybe what we're going to see?
There's definitely the potential for that. I'm always hesitant to do too many forecasting. I know I'm an economist.
Yeah, that's because guys like me will call you on it at the office.
But I do think that given all of these symptoms of the disease that we have of too much government in our economy, that we are due for a turnaround. And whenever they start selling or not buying as many of the government debt that's being issued, the Federal Reserve, when they're ending their quantitative easing program, we're going to start to see interest rates rising. Interest rates are actually going up right now. When you look at 10-year notes, 2-year notes as well, you're seeing interest rates currently rising, still a negative real interest rate, as inflation is higher than those nominal rates. But that will also decrease the amount of investment in the economy, slowing growth and so forth. So there are complications. Also, if you think about this, housing affordability. I mean, the affordability issue is a major problem. And so what we haven't seen as much is, you've seen a massive increase in the money supply, right? Increase, and that's inflationary. But we haven't seen the same increase in the consumer price index inflation. But asset prices are up dramatically. Look at the stock market, look at real estate prices. The bond market, all these prices are up dramatically. You're going to need to see some sort of correction in those. And at the same time, I think it'll be passed along in the form of higher consumer prices over time.
Right. So not a great thing. I was hoping to get a comment. The chairman of the Chinese Communist Party just a day or two ago at Davos, and this is for you. I'm going to, your name is now morphing in my mind to Dr. Perfect Velocity, because I'm thinking of money, again, money supply, right? It's great. Anyway, sorry about that. You probably never have been called perfect velocity, but it fits, don't you think, right? I think it's very, very apropos. Anyway, so Chairman Xi implored the Federal Reserve not to raise interest rates. What do you suppose that portends for the world economy when you have the leader of the second largest economy begging the U.S. Federal Reserve not to pull back?
So I hadn't heard of that, but it in some sense it doesn't surprise me, because it is in the best interest of a lot of emerging economies for the Fed not to tighten rates, because if the Fed starts to raise rates here in the United States, that's going to strengthen the dollar. A lot of emerging economies have dollar-denominated debt. They've borrowed in dollars, and so a stronger dollar makes it a lot harder for them to pay that off. But that is pretty shocking to have the sovereign of a foreign state instructing the monetary authority of the United States.
Yeah, I thought so as well. So let's project forward a little bit. We see what is likely happening politically, where there's probably a decent chance. I'm going to go ahead and forecast, and I'm going to say, as a political forecaster, that the parties in control of the U.S. House and Senate will change hands after the November election. Yet, we will still have the addled, cognitively challenged chief executive in the White House, more than likely. So from an economic standpoint, with one party controlling the levers of regulatory regime and a lot of the knock-on effects, for example, with financial regulation, how do you see that shaking out economically?
Well, I think they're going to end up using a lot more executive orders. You'll see a lot more of the regulations. They're not going to be able to push this through Congress, which fortunately the Build Back Better, also known as Build Back Bankrupt, is dead, but it's going to be coming back. Like, they're already talking about bringing that back in some form. Hopefully it will die again. There's some talk about getting rid of the Trump tax cuts, but I think Senator Sinema in Arizona has said, no, we're not going down that route. So I think we've got some stopgaps in place that can keep the major disaster from happening. But the regulatory side is also very costly, right? One of the things that the Trump administration did quite well was start to deregulate, roll things back so that way you can free up private sector investment and everything else that allows for more economic growth and job creation. And so in many ways, when the Trump administration came in, they reversed those within just a few days. And that already put a kind of a tidal wave of slowing economic growth within the economic system. And so I think you'll see more of that over the next year. I mean, in some sense, we may have more of a lame duck Congress, which wouldn't be a bad thing. Just hit pause. Just don't do anything for a while. On the other side of this, though, I think that you talked about changing hands, and we need more of a conservative push going into the election. It can't just be running against how bad that Biden has made things or the Democrats have made things. It has to be a pro-growth message. One, talking about how the importance of deregulation, the importance of tax cuts and keeping taxes low, but also the importance of spending restraint. Something that we've been pushing a lot and talking a lot about here are fiscal rules. We've been working with this here in Texas. Texas passed the strongest state spending limit in the nation last year based on population growth and inflation. We should be doing that at the federal level. Last year I published what's called the Responsible American Budget. And just if over the last 20 years, if Congress had just matched population growth and inflation, instead of adding nearly $20 trillion in debt over the last 20 years, we would have actually had a surplus of $2.8 trillion. That's a $23 trillion swing by just matching population growth and inflation, just slowing the growth. And that's something we've got to do, because if you don't, we're going to have massive tax increases in the future, higher interest rates, higher inflation to pay for that excess spending, or massive spending cuts, which are unlikely to happen.
Tyler, you've served in the White House, and what's interesting to me is, given what's going on now, what do you think the conversations are like where you used to work? Do you believe that the people who took over from your position have any clue as to how badly things are being bungled right now? How do they get out of this? What do you think they're talking about?
That's a very good question, and from what I can tell from media appearances, a lot of them are working remotely. So I do question whether the serious economists are having much, if any, influence on the formation of domestic economic policy in the Biden administration. I would imagine that there is some degree of embarrassment when they have to formulate their 10-year budget forecast and set out the economic assumptions that go into that forecast, because I imagine they are probably coming under immense pressure to forecast inflation near the Fed's target of 2%. And I struggle to see some of my former colleagues being able to stomach that. I mean, it's laughable. It's laughable to say, and to say so in their mid-session review last year. So in June of 2021, when you already have data for 6 months of the year, to still be forecasting inflation just slightly above 2%, when we already have data showing it's going to be more like 6%.
Hang on, let me ask you a question. This is I think, a very interesting question for the audience. So the two of you were political appointees, right? So tell me briefly, in your respective offices, of the people you worked with, you mentioned your colleagues, how many of those people, either in percentage or number, are also political, but how many are essentially permanent, or people who are professional economists who've worked for the federal government for a period of time?
With the Council of Economic Advisors, the vast majority are either political appointees or academics on leave from their home institutions, and there tends to be a fair amount of self-selection with a new administration. So people who come to serve want to serve that administration, and then there are, from my agency, there were 2 career civil servants, and they were both very, very good economists. And they gave us they would push back when they disagreed with something that we were setting forth. And I expect that they are probably doing the same in the current administration. And one former colleague in particular, I mean, he must be pulling his hair out because he was worried about inflation in 2018 when there was no sign whatsoever. And inflation expectations were falling, and
Right.
3/4 of the flows into employment were individuals coming in from out of the labor force.
Right, right.
So I can only imagine what he's
Right, the
saying
theory
today.
back then was things were too good, the labor market was too tight, and there should be more inflation under Trump. What they weren't calculating was investments were going up, productivity was going up, more people were attracted to work, which goes to your points about the record numbers of people working and the low unemployment. And by the way, while also somewhat restricting the flow of illegal labor into the country, which then allowed Americans to get jobs that we were told Americans didn't want to work.
Yeah, it was a little bit different to the other question about what it was like at OMB versus CEA. I mean, CEA had a lot of economists. So I was the chief economist. OMB is a 535-person agency, so it's pretty large. I was on senior staff, one of 7. There weren't a lot of other economists. I had a team of economists, though, but they were all career staff. There were 10 Ph.D. economists. They were great to work with, but they were all career staff who pushed back a lot. And so that's why I would go and see my friend Tyler, and we would kind of converse in his office about what's all going on and what are the next steps that we're going to take, because there is that pushback, the entrenchment within government of the career staff that's just been there for so long. They will continue to fight back. So I worked directly for Russ Vought, and he did a lot of good things at trying to change that environment, but it's very difficult to do. There's just a lot of inertia within the system.
So I don't want to get too alarmist or apocalyptic, but if you look at the money supply relative to the growth of the economy and the inflation that we've already experienced from the onset of the Great Recession to today, right? So if you just look at those 3 factors, discounting the velocity of money, right? I won't go there again, right? Now, I'm always thinking about it, though. So what you find, at least by my calculations, is that we have another 65% of devaluation or monetization of the dollar to go to get back to where we were then, right? So if you look again, size of the economy, amount of money in circulation, and the inflation that's already water under the bridge, that's pretty significant. I can't recall a time other than when America was just printing fiat currency hand over fist, like during the Revolutionary War, during the Civil War. I can't recall another time when we might have been facing a prolonged and significant period of inflation. Is that something that you think could happen? Or do you think that because the dollar is still the world's reserve currency, that we still have a bit of grace and potential of that not happening?
The late international economist Rudy Dornbush used to say that international bond markets are always going to be willing to lend the U.S. just enough rope to hang itself. He also said that in economics, crises take longer to happen than you thought they would, and when they happen faster than you thought they could. I don't see the U.S. losing its dollar reserve status anytime soon. The renminbi is not a credible alternative because you can't get your money out. They have capital controls. The euro is not at the moment a credible alternative because you don't have a single euro-denominated debt instrument. So the market there is just not deep and liquid enough. I am very concerned by the difference between the monetary expansion in the aftermath of 2008, 2009, and the monetary expansion in 2020, 2021, and actually continuing into 2022. Right. In the aftermath of 2008, 2009, a lot of that, the majority of that monetary expansion by the Fed was neutralized by the fact that they were paying banks interest on excess reserves. So if you held more reserves at the Fed would pay you interest on that. In addition, after Dodd-Frank, we were forcing banks to hold bigger capital buffers. So there was a lot of financial suppression in the aftermath of 2008, 2009, such that if you look at so-called M2, which includes cash, it includes checking accounts, it includes savings accounts, money market mutual funds. It's a fairly broad category of money. That actually didn't didn't really increase much after 2008, 2009. Today, we have had, I think the last time I checked, it was up about 50%. And that is a very different kettle of fish from the aftermath of 2008, 2009, when that was just excess reserves parked at the Fed. This is cash in bank deposit accounts. And right now, Americans are sitting on about $2 trillion in excess savings, which is one reason why I expect the demand to continue to be elevated in 2022.
Wow. What do you think, Vance? Do you think that we're potentially on a precipice of unprecedented inflation?
It very well could be. One of the things, you mentioned Jimmy Carter earlier, but one of the things that he did do that was good was that he nominated Paul Volcker as Fed chairman. And when Paul Volcker came in, a lot of people think it was Reagan, but it was Carter. And Volcker came in, hit the brake on the money supply, interest rates shot up. Y'all remember this, right? Like prime interest rates were up to what, 21%?
21%.
21%. It's quite a difference than it is today. And that helped. You had a double dip recession during that time as he basically hit his stop on the money supply, interest rates rose, then he pushed on the money supply again, then you had a little bit of an expansion, and then they stopped it again because inflation just kept going up. So you had this double dip recession during that period, which was pretty costly, right? High unemployment rate, a lot less investment overall, and that may be what we're due for right now. The problem is that Jay Powell, the chairman, Jerome Powell, was renominated. So we already have a history of what he would do and what he's been doing. I don't see him changing that. And so even though they're hitting a little bit of a pause on the brake over this next year, which hopefully will start to slow some of the inflationary pressures that are out there, there's just already so much baked in the cake. So I don't know if that gets us up to PPI is closer to, the producer price index is closer to 10% right now. So maybe CPI gets us closer to 10% and then we start to slow. But I don't see that there's a lot of good reason to believe that it won't go down or it will go down at a faster rate.
Yeah, this may be the time for some of you to revisit some of these classic SNL sketches where I think it was, I'm trying to remember the actor that was talking about how under Jimmy Carter, he was playing Jimmy Carter and said, inflation ain't so bad. Every American can have a $5,000 suit and enjoy a $50 cigar. So just think about it, right? I mean, there's really some upsides to this, isn't there? I mean, tell us about the actual effect of inflation, though. Is inflation a form of taxation? How does that work?
It is. It's a hidden tax, right? There's a couple of ways that can work. I mean, one is just taking more money for you to buy the same basket of goods and services that you could buy before. Right? It works as a tax. Fortunately, with TICJA, Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, they indexed it for inflation now at the different brackets. So that helps to where you just don't jump up into a new income tax bracket. It's based on chain CPI, so that's not quite the CPI. But even chain CPI was up 6.7%. over the last year, which is still pretty substantial. So that will help. But then if you have capital gains or dividends, those aren't indexed for inflation. So that would also ratchet up the amount of taxes that you have to pay on them.
So you said, wait a minute, they're not indexed for inflation.
Not. Correct.
So we are being taxed by our government for illusory gains on our capital assets. Mm-hmm. So if you bought something for 100 and there's 20% inflation and you sell it for, let's say 119, so you're actually losing real money, you're taxed on that 19. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Well, that stinks.
Yeah. Yep. And so it's another form of tax, though, which continues to eat away not only at your purchasing power, but investment and growth and everything else. And we used to talk a lot about inflation, even like you said earlier, even during the Trump years. But I mean, this is a whole new ballgame now. And the other side of this, too, Tyler, is that I don't see any sort of their policies. They're trying to argue that Build Back Better is a supply side that's going to help with inflation. It's just ridiculous. I mean, I don't see any other policies that would help to free up some of these resources.
Yeah, and we can, it's informative to look back at the last episode of persistently high inflation in the United States and what happened then. And the problem is that you have workers who don't have the same negotiating power as other workers, and for them, wages lag inflation. And that's why we keep hearing that inflation is somehow good for American workers, and particularly lower skilled or historically disadvantaged Americans. In the latter half of the 1960s, it was the bottom of the income distribution whose wages lagged inflation by the most. And furthermore, you have disparities in real wealth, in real assets that are amplified or exacerbated by high inflation. If you already own your own home, then you have some inflation hedge. But a lot of people who aren't exposed to stock markets, don't own their own home, inflation is really quite painful. And as Vance said, it is also a transfer of wealth from lenders to borrowers, and the biggest borrower in the world is the United States federal government.
And Chuck, on that point, what we've also seen is this massive transfer, the redistribution. The main cause of income inequality is government, in my view. And that's what we're seeing right now. I mean, upper income people are going to continue to be doing better off, and their wages, their stocks and assets are growing at a faster rate. Just think about wealth inequality as well. And that's something that we saw during the Trump administration. In 2019, income inequality was actually going down, because it was based on pro-growth policies and not these other types of policies that are coming at it from a Keynesian sort of view of trying to prop things up through more government spending, which as we know, right, the government can't stimulate anything else but more government. That's kind of this perpetual thing that we see.
Sure, please.
Just to put some numbers on what Vance just articulated. We keep hearing, we always hear that the 2017 tax cuts were trickle-down economics. They were tax cuts for the rich and big business. If you look at the change in real wages, so adjusted for inflation, for the bottom 10% of the wage distribution, they rose by 10%. For the top 10% of the wage distribution, they rose by 5%. So positive across the board, but skewed toward the lower end. If you look at wealth, real wealth, adjusted for inflation, the real wealth for the bottom 50% increased by 28.4%. Real wealth for the top 1% increased by just over 8%. So it is factually untrue that those were tax cuts designed for the rich.
Why did Trump hate the rich?
Well, truth.
They all did better off.
Well, and actually, truth be told, I think the only households who saw a net tax increase under the 2017 tax law were the highest income filers in high tax blue states.
Yes.
For whom the old deduction for state and local taxes was
Salt deduction, the salt deduction, yes. I know we're getting on the precipice of questions from the audience, so I want all of the audience to begin to think of your questions, and then a warning. The question should end in a question mark. This is our presentation. This is not your time to hold forth. This is our time to hold forth. So make sure it's a question. So think about it. One last question to you before we go to the audience, though, because I really want to hear from some audience questions. Tyler, perhaps this was your counterpart. Perhaps it was just a talking head. But I remember a month or two ago, someone in the Biden orbit said that inflation was what, a high-class problem? What's that all about? How is it that inflation is a high-class problem? What do you suppose they were trying to communicate? And who was that idiot anyway?
So it was my predecessor, one of my predecessors, Jason Furman, who was CEA chair for 4 years under President Obama. And first of all, I mean, this is part of a sort of treadmill of descriptions of inflation in 2021. First, it wasn't happening. Right. Then it was isolated in just a few sectors. If you strip out used cars, if you strip out new cars, you know, then inflation is and then all of a sudden,
the things people buy, if you just start stripping them out.
Right. And then it was, okay, inflation is here and it's in certain sectors, but it's transitory. It's in all sectors, but it's transitory. And then we got to the point where Furman was trying to say, well, the reason we have high inflation is because households are so flush with cash. And so in a way, it's a sort of high-class problem, or it's a problem that results from things being pretty good. And then now, I think most recently, President Biden has put the blame directly on the guy he just renominated for
Corn
another
Pop.
4 years.
Was that Corn Pop?
It was Jay Powell for another 4-year term as Fed chair. And he also elevated the other senior most member of the Federal Open Market Committee, Lael Brainard, to another 4-year term.
Yep. And then on top of that, he's now blaming the private sector. He's blaming the businesses.
Oh, that's right.
The meat
Big
companies.
meat.
Big
Big
meat.
meat.
Big meat. That's right.
That's right.
So now it's all the monopoly's fault.
Right,
They're
right.
pointing their finger at everyone else when they still have 3 that are pointing back at them.
Yeah, I see
know?
how that works.
Yeah, and it's a massive problem. I mean, they've had so many failures over the last year, not only in economics, but that's just one of them. And so they've got to find some way out and use any talking point that they can, because I mean, there's some discussion among the economic community about whether or not we have a tight labor market. We have a 3.9% unemployment rate. U.S. Is there a tight labor market? But I mean, we have so many people that have dropped out of the labor force. Labor force participation rate still remains depressed. Even the prime age, 25 to 54, labor force participation's down. So anyway,
let's go to questions. We have an individual with a mic, so you're going to wait for the mic to come to you. So first of all, raise your, okay, here in the back, the very back row. We'll wait till the mic gets to you, okay? And then please ask your question. Do you have it right back here? Oh, I thought that it was a person right behind you. Wasn't that an individual raised their hand? Oh, pardon me. All right. I just see all this motion out there. Okay. So here we go. Here's a question. Thank you.
On that point, Vance, it goes right into my question. I'd like you guys to give me your 1 to 2 year estimate on the labor force participation rate and how that'll affect the GDP.
Oh, that's a very nerdly question. Congratulations.
Well, I mean, when you're thinking about factors of production, you have capital, labor, technology, and I don't really see a huge increase in technology. Maybe there will be some things that will expand there. Capital is being tightened, especially given the policies that we have right now. So labor has got to be the big one, I think, to drive a lot of the economic growth. And I'm hopeful that these individuals will start to go back into the labor force to clear up some of these shortages. But the problem is, what are the expectations? People base, I believe, in rational expectations. So they base their future on the amount of expectations of changes in policy or whatever else it may be. When is going to be the next check? When's the next stimulus check going out, quote unquote stimulus check? Or what other sort of ways are they going to be paid by this administration not to work? And I think at some point, though, they're going to start running out of the savings that they have on the sidelines, because Tyler's right. That has been a massive increase from a number of payments that were done over the period and unemployment benefits that they started to sit on and everything. Because, I mean, many people were getting paid more than what they made at their job. Some people with all the expansion were actually getting paid about $100,000 a year. From some of the work that I know Casey Mulligan and some others have done. And so I think that we need to see that start to improve and recover before the economy really recovers and gets back to a level of what I would consider to be full employment.
You want to take that question on about labor force participation?
Right. So
Or is it permanent?
Right. So if I recall correctly, labor force participation on the eve of the pandemic was about 63.4%, and it's at sort of 61.8% now. And it basically hasn't recovered at all since August 2020. I have to imagine that a lot of those 1.5 million early retirements that I mentioned, it could be as high as 1.8 million. I think we have to suspect that a lot of those folks won't come back. Even if we get all of the pandemic issues resolved, all of the school nonsense resolved, that's 2.3 million Americans who have reported pandemic-related issues why they didn't look for work in the past month. Maybe all 100% of them come back, but I just don't see it. So I think that we're probably looking at a slow recovery in labor force participation, but not getting back to 63.4%, in part because real wages are declining. Right. People respond to real wages, not nominal wages, and when real wages are declining, that's not much of a draw back into employment.
Maybe that's why we need all of those individuals from Haiti and Central America to come up here and work again, right? Is that how that works? Open borders will solve your labor problem, won't it?
I guess so, but I would point back to, and Vance has mentioned this a few times, the economic state of affairs on the eve of this shock was such that as I said, 3/4 of the flows into employment were Americans coming back into the workforce from out of the labor force. And whereas during the entire expansion from July 2009 through December 2016, 1.6 million prime-age Americans, people between the ages of 25 and 54, they left the labor force. After 2016, 2.3 million of them were enticed back into the labor force. That's what good tax policy can do.
All right, about 3 rows back right here. Yes, thank you.
Okay, I was going to say, thank you, gentlemen, for being here. Quick questions, like you said. Number one, didn't Trump add to the debt? Number two, what about the words nationalizing the debt? Number three, are we ever going to pay off the debt? And number four, if we were to nationalize the debt, would it be World War III? Thank you.
Wow. Is that a display of greed, a question greed, or can you answer that? Let's go first with Tyler. Could you answer some of that? Because that's some pretty meaty stuff there about 4 interrelated questions.
So the deficit did increase under the Trump administration, driven largely by the bipartisan budget acts, which were with a very close Congress. Those were spending negotiations that basically resulted in Democrats wanting a lot of increases, Republicans wanting a lot of increases. You got a lot of increases. And whereas the tax cuts really, people talk about it as a big business tax cut. Only $330 billion of that $1.5 trillion bill was on the business side. $600 billion was an expansion of the child tax credit. Now, maybe there's a long-run fertility channel through which that increases growth and we get more tax revenue, but I don't think there's a lot of dynamic feedback coming from there. Whereas on the corporate side, I think that was definitely paying for itself. In terms of nationalization of the debt, look, Jay Powell's in a very tricky spot right now, because when debt to GDP, when the ratio of federal debt to GDP is north of 100%, you can run budget surpluses till the cows come home, but that is just swamped by the dynamics of the interest you're paying on your debt and the growth of the economy. And so when interest rates start to rise and the federal government debt burden starts to rise, what's Jay Powell gonna do? I mean, that's a really tricky situation. So when we look to history, in the aftermath of 1945, we benefited from a big growth tailwind, not likely to be repeated anytime soon, in part for demographic reasons. We had some financial repression, which was basically the United States introduced some controls on the flow of capital, outflows of capital, and they pressured a lot of banks, implicitly or explicitly, to hold federal government debt. I wouldn't recommend those measures today. And the third path out was inflation.
Yeah. I mean, the debt definitely increased, and it's too much spending. I mean, ultimately, to your point, I mean, the spending problem is a bipartisan problem. Republicans and Democrats are spending too much and willing to spend too much. Even if you look at the data, going back to the CBO reports, Congressional Budget Office, nonpartisan, quote unquote, CBO. Anyway, if you look at their revisions that they make over time, I mean, within, I think it was 3 years, TICJA had already paid for itself, given that. And just the amount of increase in revenue that you saw over time. And look, I'm not one of those who just says cut taxes and then they automatically pay for yourself. I think you also have to restrain spending. And ultimately, that was not what was done. We've seen that during the Kennedy years, Kennedy LBJ tax cuts, massive deficits. The Reagan years, massive deficits. George W. Bush, massive deficits. And Trump, massive deficits. But you have to go all the way back to Calvin Coolidge, one of my favorite presidents, where they cut taxes, restrained spending, and that's where you saw surpluses and shrinking the overall debt. So a lot of this nationalization of the debt or monetization, I mean, a lot of that's already happening. I mean, 3/4 of all the new debt that's being issued is being purchased by the Fed, right? And so you have this sort of situation where they're continuing to purchase that, which is drawing in more up inflation over time.
Yeah,
If I'm understanding your question.
Don't forget those 2 or 3 years.
Okay, we'll talk.
Don't forget those 2 or 3 years under Clinton where you had the surplus because you had the so-called peace dividend from the end of the Cold War, right? So they, in my view, irresponsibly began to precipitously cut defense spending. And then because you had the other party, Newt Gingrich, controlling Congress, you had some restraint for the first time, but that was also during an era of very rapid growth because of the introduction, the revolution of the internet and a lot of things going on in the tech sector. So you had some interesting productivity gains. So yeah, that's we're living in interesting times, yes. In the very back against the wall, yes. Very good, thank you.
Hi, so my name is Andrew Parks, Director of Government Relations at TSTC. Every time I have seen a breakdown of inflation by category, the single biggest category is gas prices. They're up 50% last year. And my question to you is, how much of that is driven by the extra supply of money flowing into the economy? How much of that is because of the restriction of oil supply? And how much additional drag do you think that puts on the recovery going forward?
Wow, great question.
Sure. Well, yes, federal government actions to restrict domestic energy production have definitely been a factor. Energy is also a global commodity, and we have seen energy prices rise substantially across the globe. In Britain, it's a big issue right now. I actually think that moving forward, the bigger issue and the shoe that has yet to drop on the inflation front is shelter, rent, and owner equivalent rent. That alone is about 40% of the consumer price index. And we have seen double-digit increases in home prices. We have seen double-digit increases in rent for new leases. And as that starts to feed into how the consumer price index is calculated, I think we're going to see a lot of continued pressure, inflationary pressure coming from rent. And regardless of how the index is constructed, people are feeling it. I'm in the Bay Area. I'm feeling it.
Yeah, and to your point, I mean, oil prices going up, right, is contributing to the price of gasoline at the pump going up. Well, oil going up also leads into a lot of other products. I mean, it's a raw material that goes into the production, so that's got to be passed along at some point, and we're seeing a lot of that already. I mean, I think Axios Austin, they showed today that gasoline prices in Austin are up 42% compared to a year ago today. So we're seeing that, and it's still below $3, which is less than what you're paying in California, right?
We're like $5.30.
Ouch, $5.30 in California. But still, that's a large increase, and especially from where we were just a few years ago when there was a lot more talk about energy independence and things of that nature. Now we've turned that around where the Biden administration stopped the Keystone XL pipeline, right? He was asking OPEC and countries that aren't very friendly with us to produce more so we can import more. This doesn't make sense. And so what you have to continue to consider are what are going to be the economic repercussions for their actions, and we are seeing the economic repercussions. A lot of times when you say, well, let's based on good intentions, but again, Milton Friedman said, don't judge a policy by its intentions, but by its results. And the results here are devastating to millions of Americans all across this great country.
So let's have a quick follow-on to that question about, in this case, gasoline prices. I've seen some very interesting data in the last week about the availability of fertilizers, and we had one of our earlier speakers speak about that briefly. If you look at how fertilizers are made, right, you take nitrogen from the air, natural gas, and that's the bulk of, in this case, the nitrous part of, obviously not potassium or sulfur, but the huge part of the fertilizer component. So a huge energy cost. I saw just a week ago where China has ceased exports of their considerable fertilizers for which, for example, India was the #1 market. I think Malaysia as well. There are very sobering implications with productivity, right, with agricultural productivity globally, as well as the price of fertilizer here in America, because if the Indians can't get their fertilizer from China as they've used to get it, I'm presuming fertilizer is just like a barrel of oil. It's an international commodity. It's bought and sold and traded. What sort of implication might this have not only on the price of food, but on the availability of basic foodstuffs if farmers are not applying as much fertilizer to their crops because they can't even get a hold of it?
So I actually think this is a microeconomic issue in one sector, and we miss perhaps the macroeconomic forest for the microeconomic trees, because we actually see these sorts of dynamics, these sorts of pressures across sectors. And with key components, if there's a bottleneck in a single key component, then that just chokes up the whole rest of the supply chain. And I spoke a couple months ago with the chief procurement officer for one of the largest truck leasing companies in the United States, and he also happens to run the monthly Institute for Supply Management's manufacturing survey. And he said that the chip shortage issue, and China has some role in that as well, that is a 2.5 year process, and we're only about 1.25 years into that when you speak with industry experts. The labor shortage issue is an issue across sectors. Absenteeism, these retirees are being replaced with younger workers who frankly don't have the same skills and human capital that the retired workers that they're replacing had. And he said that they're just hearing that across survey sectors.
Wow. So we've got some things that perhaps people haven't considered, or unless they're actually in the sector, that they don't notice. Yes. Third row, back, and then, sir, we'll get to you on the first row. So I think we have someone in the third row over here. And then after that, the gentleman in the front row. We have any people over here that have been raising their hands that I've missed? Okay.
Well, thank y'all. My name is Jimmy Stanford. I'm a local city councilman in Burleson, Texas. One of the big problems that we're having with the inflation is, from a city standpoint, everybody wants their taxes lowered. This is driving people's home values up exponentially. So from the legislative side, or from the administration side, I don't really get to legislate much at my level. But the issue is that when we lower the tax rate and lower the taxes to try and help out our local consumers, how do we pay for our roads? How do we pay for our police and everything else? Because that's all gone up. And so we're seeing our, we just did a bond the other day looking at it. It was going to be a $3 million project if we could have done it 2 years ago. Now it's going to be $5 million. We're doing that with less. Now, I've talked to you earlier about the sales tax. I am 100% on board because that would go right along with inflation. So if there's something I can do along that end, I don't know if y'all have the answers to this, but I'm just throwing it out there and love to hear from you.
It's a great question. The first thing that comes to mind is that the inflation's not just a national thing. I mean, it's a local thing as well. It's affecting the cost of the goods and services that local government is also spending, which means the taxpayer is going to have to fund it in some capacity. Just like at the state level, a lot of sales taxes are flowing in right now. The latest estimate that I heard from the comptroller is that we were going to have a $12 billion surplus. $12 billion. That's not even including the rainy day fund, which already has $12 billion in it. So that's $24 billion extra dollars that we're going to have floating around. Now, there's going to be some extra cost, like Medicaid's probably going to be about a $5 billion shortfall. So that's state level stuff. But then you get down to the local level, to what you're talking about here. I mean, look, we are trying to get rid of a lot of taxes in Texas. I mean, one of our big issues at TPPF is to eliminate property taxes. It's a wealth tax, shouldn't be used. There's a lot of problems with it, and move us more towards a sales tax. So what we've done at the state level is to say, look, any general revenue that's above population growth and inflation, which is our new state spending limit, the strongest in the nation, any general revenue above that should go to buy down school maintenance and operation property taxes across the state, right? I think the same sort of construct should be done at the local levels for cities and counties. They should also have spending limits on themselves, impose it on themselves to say, look, we're not going to spend more than the average taxpayer's ability to pay for it as measured by population growth and inflation. And any general revenue that comes above that should go towards lowering their property taxes. And then maybe one day allow them to the ability just to swap out their property tax for a sales tax or something. But I think that would allow it to be even more pro-growth and provide the needed dollars to cover any needed expenses along the way. Because there are going to be some needs that come about. With that said, I would also always look at zero-based budgeting and program-based budgeting. Always try to find as much lean as you can to cut off, so that way you won't have to increase taxes along the way.
Front row. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. The methodology for calculating inflation has changed over time. Given the calculation used today as compared to, say, 1982, which one's correct? And what are your thoughts on that, please?
Well, that's also a very nerdy technical question. You guys must love these questions. This is very high end. This is a high class problem to have.
It is a high-class problem to have. Neither.
Yeah.
Look, I think there are legitimate reasons for why, for example, since the 1980s, we have moved from unchained to chained price indices. There are reasons why we adjust for quality, although the adjustments for quality, that it's a bit art as well as science. You know, the Fed tends to look at an index that allows for the fact that when prices for some goods go up, people substitute toward very similar but slightly different goods. Now I can see why that is a preferred measure, but you know, in terms of how people are actually feeling when they go to pay their utility bills, when they go to pay their rent, when they go to buy groceries, you know, they're not taking into account the fact, oh well, I can substitute this brand for that brand, or I can substitute this product for that. And then the other big change would be in how they calculate rent. And I think the current method is probably better than that of the 1970s, but still highly imperfect.
When my price of propane has gone up, I keep trying to convince my wife that when I break apart the furniture to create a fire, that's substitution, but she doesn't buy it. It still heats the house, right? I mean, no, that's not, okay. Not quite? Not getting that economic principle quite right? Okay, so right down here, and then in the back after this.
Wait, Chuck, we have one back here.
Okay. Can't see all the way back there. There's a bright light right in my eye. So.
John Rockwell from New Mexico. So if I understood right, there's a whole lot of cash available, and we're raising interest rates. I don't quite understand that, how that works. If there's a lot of cash, why would interest rates go up? And the other thing is, both of you hedged on what inflation's going to look like in the next 2 or 3 years.
He's calling. This is a circle back.
Well, it's one thing for where would the cash go, right? Does the cash go to buy more of the bonds as they're being issued? Because we're going to continue to run deficits. So if we don't, then that pushes the price of bonds down, which would increase interest rates, right? So there's the interest rate increase, unless that cash is then used to buy it. But right now it's been substituted out because of so much is being purchased by the Federal Reserve, right? And their money creation and monetizing that overall debt. So I guess it's a question of where those dollars will go. With such a massive amount by families and businesses actually having this amount of savings, as Tyler alluded to or said earlier, where will that go? And then with inflation, I mean, I think we're sitting, what, 7% year over year now, so maybe it's continuing to be pretty rapid, but you got to think that maybe it's going to come back down given that the Federal Reserve is going to start raising interest rates. So how do they do that? They've got to sell their bonds. This pulls money out of the marketplace, which helps to shrink the money supply over time. So that would be given everything else, all else constant, that would be an area to where you can see slower growth rate of inflation.
All right, we got probably one more. I want it first to go to Tyler, way in the back.
Yes, I'm curious to know what you gentlemen think about the last year when Biden's been giving out the child tax credit early, and what kind of bomb that's going to drop this tax season on families.
Sure. So I don't think it should drop a huge bomb come tax season. I mean, it expired already, December 31st. I think it was terrible for labor force participation because, first of all, it means as it phases out, it's a higher implicit marginal tax on work. They lowered the threshold over which it phases out, so that's a higher implicit marginal tax on work for more workers. And they eliminated the work requirement that the 2017 tax law introduced, that basically the tax was fully refundable against earned income. So you had to be working and earning income for that tax credit to apply to you, and they basically eliminated that. Don't want to hedge on your question. So 7% inflation in 2021. I don't think I think it'll be less than 7% in 2022. Not back down to 2% or slightly below 2%. So I would say probably we're looking at 4 to 5%. Now, the big question for me is, so inflation is probably going to come down. It is not going to come down to 2% without some really aggressive action by the Fed. What worries me is when I talk to a lot of academic colleagues on both the left and center right, there are no right anymore, there's a growing case, a growing consensus that we should have a higher target, a higher inflation target. 3% is
Giving up. Giving up.
is what I usually hear. And I'm reminded of something that Alan Greenspan used to say, which is when asked what should an inflation target be, he said, well, it should be low enough that people don't really notice price increases. Because once consumers are aware of prices going up, they start adjusting their
Right.
price negotiations, and so do businesses, and that's the ratchet effect.
So, ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm Texas welcome. Vance Ginn, Tyler Goodspeed. Thank you.